Hey everybody, this is Jared. I am here with another episode of CX Disruptors. And today I have Zeus Kerravala with us, who is the founder and principal analyst at ZK Research. Zeus?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to this.
All right. Well, in that case, we will jump right in. We'll start with a softball. So what do you think changed in 2023 that will have the biggest impact on the new year?
Well, I think this is the topic that everybody talks about at every trade show now, right? Which is generative AI. It was said when ChatGPT launched, I think it was Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, that called it the iPhone moment. And in a lot of ways, it was because it democratized the technology where everybody could use it. Before that, I think AI was kind of a complicated technology that only few use, but now everyone's become familiar with it. I think what's interesting to think about in 2024, though, is we are just now learning how to use it, right? Many of the early use cases have been to assist the agent, but in the contact center space, we really haven't used it as a way to create content yet and things like that. And so if you think of the broad world of CX that includes sales and marketing, support, service, things like that. That's all part of the customer journey. Those areas have been largely dealt with in silos, and so if we could use the data from all those and get a lot sharper with how we do things, that's interesting to think about. Also, I think Gen AI makes the virtual interfaces much better, and this historically has been something that a lot of times, as soon as you're talking to a virtual agent, you start saying agent, right? Because you want to talk to a person.
Absolutely.
But what if that virtual experience was actually better than a human experience? Whoops. Then you would prefer that interface. And while some people aren't really sure that'll ever happen, I'll give you just a very simple example. Think of when online reservations started, like OpenTable and Resy and things like that. At first, people said, why would you ever want to do that? Isn't it better to just call the restaurant? But now, right, well, it was back then, right?
Yeah.
I remember, talking to my boss at the time about that, and she's like, I don't see why anybody would ever do that. But now, if you try and make a reservation, you don't have an online interface, you probably aren't going to eat there, right? And so I think we'll get to a period where the virtual interfaces will get so good that when you get a human, you'll go, oh, I got a human. I don't need a human for this task, right? So I actually do think it's going to create a whole new way of interacting with brands. But like I said, we're just learning that now, how to use these things. And I think 2024 will be a year of learning how to, where's best to apply these technologies.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think I would say that everybody immediately hates bots. I mean, I'm with you. I usually start yelling agent, shortly before curse words.
Yeah.
But I think it's more use case dependent, right? Because, if I had an example from another interview where somebody said, like, look, I had to activate my credit card. I called, you're supposed to punch in the number, you're done, right? It's 10 seconds. And a person answered and he was actually annoyed and thought like, hey, I actually want a bot. So I guess it's maybe more of a balancing, I would say, that you're going to find more use cases where,
I think
where
if you were to take
an AI agent is so much, it's just easier.
I think if you were to take all the different ways we interact with a brand, like all the interactions, and you put them on a 2x2 grid, right? And as an analyst, I'm almost bound to put things on a 2x2 grid, right?
Yeah, sure.
And but the axes are complexity of interaction and frequency interaction. Things that are low complexity, high frequency. That's perfect for that virtual agent. We just got to get in the mindset of that's the right way to do it.
All right. So, well, actually, one thing I was going to ask you to circle back a little bit is, you talked a lot about Gen AI changing experiences. And one thing I wondered is a lot of the demos, a lot of the examples that we see of how you can use generative AI in customer experience. You talked about the iPhone moment, and if an iPhone actually, it just works. It's not that it's so magical. It's not that it's so amazingly innovative. It's just simple. It works. And I wonder if that's ultimately what we're going to see. It's not some, magical, mind-blowing experience. It's just going to be so simple and it works. And that's what's going to be impressive.
Well, that was interesting. I was talking with the person at the PGA Tour that runs a lot of their fan experience things, and they're experimenting with Gen AI as part of the PGA application, where you could just ask it, did so and so golfer have a hole in one of those tournament last year? Who hit the longest drive? And right now, if you were to try and look that up, you'd have to think about how to phrase the question, like if you use traditional search, right? And so I think what Gen AI does is it lets us just ask questions naturally, and then it'll compile an answer for us. And so instead of just, if I were to ask who hit the longest drive at the US Open last year, it just doesn't come back and say, Max Homer or something like that, right? But it could create the video for you. It could show you what it is. It could tell you a lot of other stats, that he outdrove everybody else by, X number of yards, things like that. So it's that's the interesting part about it, is it makes this technology just work, right? And because it does a lot of the creation for you, and that's where really that iPhone escalation comes from, because because it works through natural language, it democratizes it so everybody can use it, right? Like, prior to the iPhone, my parents, for instance, didn't have, a smartphone like a BlackBerry, but then everybody started adopting them, right?
Yeah, I wonder what you think about the idea. It's the technology may be innovative, but the experience actually won't be. It will just be simple and human and work.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's ultimately what we want. And I've often said that the best AI is invisible AI, right?
Exactly.
You have to not know it's there, and you have to not think about it. It's like when, a lot of the features in your car now, adaptive cruise control, things like that, they're AI based. You don't think of them as AI. You just turn them on and they work. You don't have to program things. And so that makes the usability of a lot higher.
All right, so we've talked about Gen AI. You hinted a little bit at data becoming very important in terms of being able to use AI. So I'm wondering, as people are freaking out about all the big things that will change, what will not change? What's going to stay the same? What's going to be the evergreen either problem or we'll say challenge for next year?
Well, I think they don't have to be challenges too. I think one of the things that will remain is voice will remain a very important channel. I think we read all the time, because of the rise of the digital channels, that voice is going to go away. People still want to talk to people. In fact, I was talking with the CIO of a mobile payment company, and they initially had no voice in their in their contact center, because they were targeting a lot of millennials and things, right? So, but then he realized that when people want to talk about money, they actually want to talk to somebody. There's a lot of anxiety when you think you made a payment and it doesn't go through. And at that moment, you really want to talk to somebody about that. And so for a lot of use cases, whether they're healthcare or, like I said, financial, or things that are timely, anything that gives you anxiety, right? The agent plays a more important role. And that's sort of part two of what won't change, is the agent's not going away, right? We predict a future with no agents. I actually think the agent is in a little bit of a Schrodinger cat position here, if you understand the analogy, where they're becoming simultaneously less important and more important. So more and more interactions start through self-service, through some sort of digital channel, but a lot of inquiries, interactions do eventually flip the agent. And so to start the interaction, the agent is far less important. To finish the interaction, the agent is far more important. And because at that moment, the customer will have already gone through a certain series of steps to triage their own problem. And at that moment, they expect that agent to have the empathy, to understand what the problem is, to have all the answers, right? And so I actually think the agent is becoming, like I said, simultaneously less important and more important. But the agent is not going away. I do think we may see the agent role change a lot. I've talked to a number of contact centers where they're thinking about how to make the agent a revenue generating person, that if I can have my in fact, there was a mortgage company I talked to in Amsterdam, where their call routing has got so good that they can often bring the customer in and onboard them and have a lot of the answers done in the first call. So that person now who answers the phone is playing a revenue generating role. So I think that those are the two big things for me. Voices here, agents are here, and they'll be here a long time.
Yeah, I always like to say agents will not be replaced. They will be displaced, but they will be going upwards in the value chain. Because like you said, instead of only being IVR, the part that says automated and covered, you're going to have a few more steps that are still going to be digital before it gets handed over.
Yeah. And isn't that better for everybody?
Absolutely.
Who wants to be on the end of a phone call where you're getting yelled at all the time? You'd rather play a more important role where you're actually adding value to that interaction, to the customer, to your company. And that creates a lot more job satisfaction.
All right. Now, so we're on the new technology binge right now. I think AI, especially as we just talked about the changing role of the agent, what does that mean for measuring the effectiveness of contact centers, right? I mean, we all know like the classic acronym salad of, AHT, FCR, et cetera, average speed of answer. It could go on all day. How relevant are they all
I think
still?
I think we got to throw those out the window.
All of them.
In
Oh my
fact,
God.
well, not all of them, but a lot of them. In fact, average handle time is one that is completely misleading. That mortgage broker I told you about in Amsterdam, their average handle time went way up, right? Because now the person's calling in, they're not just parking them and then eventually having somebody call them back. They're getting the right person right away. So something that was maybe a 5 interaction now is an hour long interaction, but they would actually close, complete an entire transaction, right? So things like average handle time are out the window. I think we should start thinking about, like, how do you measure whether a lot of these new technologies working on. One of them is agent churn, right? Agent churn has been incredibly high. The low end for companies, you're a very successful organization if you can keep your agent churn in the 30s, right? I've seen that in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s for some companies. So if you're actually giving agents the right tools and they're not burning out anymore and they're adding value and they feel like they're contributing to your organization, churn should go way down, right? And so I think that's one of the interesting things to measure. I think another one is CSAT. You can use customer satisfaction through that. And I think the the tools that you use to measure CSAT are changing as well, because it's not just surveys. A lot of the new AI-based systems can infer them in every call. And so you could actually understand where you are today and then be able to see the growth of that. And the third thing I would say is, if you are going down the path of measuring of using your agents for revenue generation, I think you could actually start tracking that as well. And so I do think we need a number of new metrics. I think, first call resolution, things like that are still important, but that would be more on the virtual side, right? That would be speed of response. If it does make it to an agent, then you'd want that to be resolved. But I think, to me, agent churn is the big one. If companies could cut their agent churn, they could get a lot higher scores across the board. Coaching time goes down, things like that. And so I do think it's time to rethink effectiveness. So.
Okay. All right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to one final question. We've talked about quite a lot. So what I'm wondering is, what is something that you think that CX leaders may not have considered going into the new year now?
Yeah, I think the big thing to me, as I mentioned, CSAT, is that I don't think most companies actually know what their CSAT is, because or even a lot of the metrics that we track are, because for something like CSAT, we send out these surveys and people give you a 1 or 10. And in a lot of cases, the person actually knows if this person doesn't get all fives, the agent will actually say it, right? Look, my bonus is based on this. If I don't get a 5, blah, blah, blah. So people will just give all fives, right? And so I think organizations largely have a false sense of what CSAT is. And so I think the great thing about AI-based systems is, because they can infer these things without actually having to ask, like based on the tone of the call, how it went. You can use it to set a baseline and then measure it from there. And so I think for CX leaders, don't fool yourself into thinking you actually understand how things are going and how the customers feel about you. Use the data in the AI systems to understand it, create a baseline, and then go from there.
So I feel like you're implying heavily sentiment analysis, where that's something that can be run on every single interaction, digital or voice, so that now you're tracking everything. But how do you track that for the people who aren't coming with a problem, right? Because if we're only tracking contact center inquiries, they're typically going to be people who have a problem, and maybe not representative of, say, I don't know, the other 80% of customers who are very happy. Do you have any idea how to get that, that other chunk of the customer?
Well, that's where you would have to start doing things like integrating with other tools that measure web transactions, even email responses, things like that. We have a lot of data. We've just not really brought it together. And I think for CX leaders, this is something that CX leaders really need to focus on too. While I hear a lot of vendors talk about customer journey, right? The customer journey is from first mouse click all the way to product retirement, and there's a whole bunch of tools used in between. And when we apply AI to one silo of that data, we get, there's a saying in machine and data sciences, right? Good data leads to good insights. Well, fragmented data leads to siloed insights, right? And that's ultimately what we have today. And I think for CX leaders, they need to find a way to bring all that data together, and then they can have a better representation of how customers feel about them.
I think this brings us back to the second question: is silos are an evergreen problem. It doesn't matter what new technology comes, that they don't seem to go away, sadly.
Yeah, and we just create more of them, right? We add another channel and we create another silo.
This is frequently true. I think some people are learning. Anyway, look, it was really fun. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you.